The moment it happened was so quick, so lightly delivered, that anyone standing nearby might have brushed it off as nothing more than a thoughtless remark. But disrespect has a strange way of revealing itself, quietly, sharply, and always at the exact moment when you least expect it. When my nephew let that insult slip from his mouth, he did it with the kind of casual confidence only someone who has never faced consequences can possess. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't dramatic, and that's exactly why it carried more weight than it should have. Words spoken softly can sometimes strike the deepest, because they come wrapped in the illusion that they don't matter. But they do. They always do. And on that day, his words carried enough sting to shift everything around us. I remember the room clearly, not because anything special was happening, but because normal moments have a way of becoming unforgettable when something cuts through them. People were talking, laughing, moving around in their own little worlds, unaware that one careless sentence was about to alter the dynamic between family members who thought they understood each other. He said it with a smirk, a tilt of the head, a hint of superiority he didn't even bother hiding. Maybe he thought he was being clever. Maybe he thought I wouldn't react. Or maybe, in his mind, he believed his age, his confidence, or his imagined status gave him permission to speak down to me in a way he wouldn't dare speak to anyone else. That's the thing about insults from family, they're rarely loud, but they hit with a force no outsider's words ever could. For a second, I wasn't sure I heard him right. It's the kind of moment where your brain pauses, rewinds, and replays the sentence just to confirm that yes, he actually said that, and yes, he said it with intention. I saw something shift in the eyes of a couple of people nearby. They heard it too. Their expressions changed in that subtle way people react when they've just witnessed something they know wasn't right but don't want to get involved in. Some glanced away quickly. Others pretended they didn't hear anything at all. But I felt it, that tightening in the chest, that sudden clarity that spreads through your mind when someone crosses a boundary they had no right to approach. There's a moment after an insult where everything slows. Not because you're shocked, but because your mind starts scanning through memories, context, history. You start wondering how long this attitude had been building, how many smaller signs you had ignored, how many tiny moments of disrespect had been brushed aside with the assumption that they meant nothing. Sometimes the real shock isn't the insult itself, it's the realization that the person who delivered it has been holding onto this arrogance for longer than you realized. It makes you question what else they've thought, what else they've said behind your back, what other moments they've dismissed or mocked without you knowing. In that brief silence after his words landed, something settled in the air between us, something heavier than anger. It was the awareness that a line had been crossed, and not in a way that could be undone. There are certain relationships in life that depend on mutual respect to function, especially within a family. Once that respect is broken, even if only for a second, something shifts permanently. You start seeing the person differently, not as the child you once helped, or the relative you supported, but as someone who chose disrespect over loyalty, who chose arrogance over decency, who allowed pride to. And he knew it too. I saw it in the way his expression flickered, just for a split second, as if he realized he had gone a little too far. But pride is a powerful thing, especially in the young, and instead of stepping back or correcting himself, he leaned into his attitude. It wasn't the insult alone that changed everything, it was the way he stood there afterward, chin lifted slightly, waiting, as if expecting me to let it go, to laugh it off, to pretend it didn't matter. That expectation, that assumption, was the real trigger. Because it wasn't just disrespect, it was entitlement. He believed he had the right to speak to me that way, and that belief was far more revealing than any insult could be. In that instant, something inside me shifted. Not rage. Not hurt. Something colder, steadier. A clarity that spreads through your thoughts like a slow-moving storm, quiet but unstoppable. I didn't react, and that silence must have confused him, but silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's observation. Sometimes it's the moment when the mind begins to plan, to calculate, to decide that this act, this small, seemingly insignificant insult, would not simply fade into the background like every other moment people chose to ignore. It was in that silence that I realized something important. Some lessons in life can only be learned through consequences. And some people, especially those who think they are untouchable, will never understand respect until they face the results of crossing the wrong person at the wrong moment. That brief, subtle insult might have seemed harmless to him, but it became the spark that lit a fire he never saw coming, a fire that would eventually reshape the dynamic of our relationship and turn his careless remark into the beginning of something he never imagined he would have to face. Disrespect from the outside world is easy to label, easy to defend against, easy to distance yourself from. When a stranger belittles you, you can shrug it off as ignorance or jealousy, and the wound fades quickly because there are no roots tying you to them. But disrespect that comes from within a family carries a different weight, a different sting, because it arrives wrapped in betrayal disguised as familiarity. It doesn't come from someone who barely knows you, it comes from someone who should have known better, someone who grew up watching you support them, guide them, protect them. That is why it cuts deeper, why it lingers longer, and why it changes relationships in ways that outsiders can never fully understand. There's an unspoken expectation within families that certain lines simply won't be crossed, not because the rules are written anywhere, but because respect is supposed to be part of the foundation you share. You assume that the people you love will speak with care, with caution, with a sense of responsibility for the bond between you. You assume they will weigh their words before throwing them at you. But when a family member chooses disrespect, especially in a moment when you least expect it, it shakes that foundation more violently than any argument with a stranger ever could. The insult from my nephew wasn't just rude, it was a revelation, a small window into how he had come to see me, and perhaps how he had been seeing me for a long time without ever saying it out loud. It's strange how one moment can force you to look backward. After his careless words echoed through my mind, I began recalling every earlier interaction, every subtle tone, every disguised remark I hadn't questioned before. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces that once looked harmless began to connect into a pattern I hadn't noticed. Maybe I had ignored the signs. Maybe I had excused his behavior because he was young, or because I believed he would grow out of it, or because I thought family relationships are fragile in ways people rarely admit. They depend heavily on mutual respect, even if that respect is never discussed openly. Without it, love becomes obligation, connection becomes habit, and conversations become opportunities for dominance instead of understanding. When my nephew delivered that insult, he didn't just hurt feelings, he exposed a fracture in the relationship that had been forming slowly over time. It wasn't the insult alone, it was the attitude behind it, the dismissiveness, the belief that he could talk down to me without consequence. That belief revealed more about our bond than any family gathering, celebration, or shared memory ever had. There's also a particular kind of disappointment that accompanies disrespect from someone younger in the family. It's not just about the insult, but about the realization that the values you tried to pass down didn't take root the way you hoped. You expect younger relatives to learn humility, gratitude, and consideration, especially when they've been raised around adults who have supported and uplifted them. When they instead choose arrogance, it feels like a personal failure, a reflection of every lesson that didn't sink in. You start to wonder where they learned this behavior, who encouraged it, and why they thought it was appropriate to direct it toward someone who had done nothing but help them. But the sting of disrespect isn't just emotional, it's relational. It shifts the balance between people. It changes the way you interact, the way you trust, the way you share parts of your life. It makes you more cautious, more guarded, more aware that not everyone who smiles at you actually respects you. The next time you speak to them, something inside you stays alert, measuring their every word with a new awareness. You start hearing the tone beneath the tone, the meaning beneath the meaning. Innocent comments become suspicious. Jokes feel sharper. Advice sounds condescending. Once disresp. And yet, the most painful part of family disrespect is that you're not allowed to show how deeply it affects you. People expect you to forgive quickly, to maintain harmony, to dismiss the insult as a moment of immaturity or stress. They say let it go, he didn't mean it, or it's not worth breaking the family over one comment. But they don't understand that disrespect is rarely isolated. That comment was not one mistake, it was a summary of everything he had been silently thinking but hadn't dared to say until confidence or entitlement pushed him over the edge. When a family member finally speaks the disrespect they've been holding inside, it becomes impossible to pretend the bond is as strong as it used to be. It also creates a quiet shift inside you, a determination not born from anger but from clarity. You begin to understand that some people in the family see kindness as weakness, patience as passiveness, and support as permission. They take advantage of the relationship, assuming you won't push back because family ties are supposed to prevent revenge, confrontation, or consequences. But that assumption is exactly what makes the insult so dangerous. It reveals that they believe they can do whatever they want without accountability. And once that belief is exposed, something inside you changes in a way that cannot be reversed. This is why disrespect from family cuts deeper. Because it forces you to see the truth behind the smiles and greetings, because it reshapes how you perceive someone you once trusted, and because it marks the moment when the relationship stops being innocent. It becomes a negotiation of boundaries, a recalibration of roles, a redefinition of what you are willing to accept. And in my case, that realization didn't just hurt, it sparked the beginning of a transformation, the moment when disappointment hardened into determination and the quiet hurt turned into the quiet resolve to teach a lesson that would be remembered far longer than the INS. There is a moment after someone disrespects you when the noise of the world seems to fade, when conversations blur, when even your own heartbeat becomes something distant. It's the moment your mind shifts from shock to understanding, from hurt to something far more controlled. That shift is subtle, but powerful. It doesn't look like anger, and it doesn't feel like rage. It feels like clarity. The kind of clarity people mistake for silence, as if staying quiet means you've accepted the insult. But silence, in moments like these, isn't surrender, it's strategy. When my nephew delivered his insult, the room continued moving around us as if nothing had happened, but something inside me instantly realigned. It wasn't the kind of wound that leads to tears or outward reaction, it was the kind that sinks deeper, that settles into a place where emotions transform and reorganize themselves. That's the point where hurt begins to harden into focus. You start to see the situation not through the eyes of someone who's been offended, but through the eyes of someone who is suddenly, unshakably aware. Aware of the disrespect. Aware of the opportunity. Aware of the lesson that needs to be taught. The shift from hurt to determination doesn't happen with dramatic music or grand gestures. It happens quietly, almost politely, like a door closing softly but permanently. I felt it the moment he finished speaking, that small spark that flickers when someone crosses a line and thinks they've walked away without consequence. He probably expected me to respond emotionally, to snap back, to defend myself, or to prove something. But sometimes the most powerful response is none at all. Because in the silence, the mind begins building something much more impactful than words. It begins building resolve. There is a certain strength in not reacting immediately. People who insult others rely on fast reactions. They want to see anger, embarrassment, or defensiveness because those reactions validate their ego. But when you respond with calm, when you simply observe, when you offer nothing for them to feed off, something shifts inside them as well. They don't understand what your silence means, and confusion begins to creep into their confidence. That is the moment when the balance of power changes without a single word being spoken. As my nephew stood there, expecting some sort of emotional outburst, I studied his expression. I saw the easy arrogance in the way he tilted his head, the impatience in the way he raised his eyebrows, the casual confidence of someone who believed he had won a moment. What he didn't realize was that silence isn't a sign of defeat, it's the first step in turning disrespect into a turning point. While he celebrated his little moment of superiority, my mind had already begun moving in a different direction, a direction he wasn't prepared for. I began recalling every moment that had led to this one. All the small remarks he had brushed off as jokes, every moment where he'd spoken without thinking, every instance where he acted like boundaries didn't apply to him. It wasn't about revenge yet, it was about understanding the pattern. Because before you decide how to respond, you have to understand what you're responding to. And in that quiet moment, I realized that this insult wasn't random. It was the result of repeated behavior that had gone unchecked, a growing sense of entitlement that needed to be corrected. The mind is sharpest in moments of silence. With no emotions clouding judgment, thoughts become clearer, more precise. I could feel the change within myself, the way my perspective shifted from being the one who was hurt to being the one who now held the advantage. Because when someone crosses a line, they reveal far more about themselves than they do about you. They reveal their weaknesses, their blind spots, their misunderstandings. And understanding those things is the first step toward turning the situation in your favor. Determination didn't announce itself with fury, it arrived quietly, settling into my thoughts like a steady pulse. I didn't want to react. I wanted to respond, and responding requires patience. Patience to wait for the right moment. Patience to let clarity guide action instead of emotion. Patience to allow the insult to become the foundation of something much larger. As I stood there, watching him smirk, that patience strengthened. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to defend myself. The real lesson wouldn't be delivered through words spoken in the heat of the moment, it would be delivered through actions that would stay with him far longer. As the room continued moving, I let myself breathe slowly, not as someone wounded, but as someone already planning. It's in moments like these that people misunderstand calmness. They see it as defeat. They assume you've backed down. But beneath that stillness, something is building, something far more formidable than anger. The hurt begins shaping itself into intention, into direction, into the beginnings of a plan. A plan not driven by revenge for revenge's sake, but by the need to restore balance, to correct arrogance, to ensure that the disrespect delivered so casually would be remembered for the lesson it carried. In that quiet shift, I could feel my role changing, from the one insulted to the one now in control. Because once you decide that silence is not the end but the beginning, everything else becomes clearer. You see paths forward. You see potential outcomes. You see exactly how this moment, small as it seemed, could be turned into something far more meaningful. The determination that settled inside me wasn't loud or explosive. It was calm, steady, precise. It carried the certainty that this insult would not be forgotten, and that the response, whenever it came, would be something he would never expect. That shift from hurt to calculated resolve is what sets certain stories in motion. It's the quiet turning point, the moment when the person who was disrespected stops reacting and starts focusing, when emotion transforms into intention, and when the foundation for the most unforgettable transformation begins forming beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to rise and reveal itself. Planning doesn't always look like sitting down with a notebook or mapping out steps on paper. Sometimes planning begins in the quiet spaces between thoughts, in the pauses where emotion gives way to strategy, in the stillness where you realize that reacting immediately would only satisfy the person who insulted you. Real planning starts when you decide not to give them what they expect. That's where the power shifts, where the situation begins to reshape itself, where humiliation transforms into something sharper, smarter, and far more controlled. After my nephew's insult, I didn't storm out, didn't raise my voice, didn't defend myself in front of everyone. Instead, I watched him. His confidence was almost entertaining, the way he carried himself as if he had proven some kind of point. He had no idea that the moment he tried to put me down was the same moment he handed me the opportunity to turn everything around. People like him believe the moment belongs to them because they spoke louder, stood taller, or made others laugh at someone else's expense. They think they've won simply because the room reacted. But the real victory is never in the instant, it's in what follows when the heat has faded and the mind is clear. Planning begins with understanding what motivates people, what they fear, what they rely on, and most importantly, where their ego is most fragile. Insults don't come from strength, they come from insecurity trying to masquerade as confidence. And once you identify the insecurity behind the arrogance, everything else becomes easier to navigate. I began observing him not out of anger, but out of curiosity. How did he speak to others? How did he behave when things didn't go his way? How did he react when someone questioned him or challenged his authority? These small details matter because every person reveals the blueprint to their downfall in the way they treat others. In the days that followed, I began to see patterns. He was polite to those he admired, dismissive toward those he saw as beneath him, and overly confident around anyone who avoided confrontation. It wasn't personal, this was who he had become. The insult he threw at me was just one of many he'd likely delivered to others, but I was the first person who had the patience to let the insult settle without giving him the reaction he wanted. Patience is often the sharpest weapon, because while the other person relaxes, convinced you have accepted defeat, you are quietly preparing something they cannot anticipate. Every moment became part of the silent plan taking shape, not revenge for the sake of revenge, but accountability wrapped in strategy. The humiliation he tried to create became a foundation, a starting point for something that would not only humble him but also open his eyes to the consequences of disrespect. His insult was not the end of anything, it was the beginning of a process that would eventually make him confront his own behavior in a way he couldn't ignore. Planning a meaningful payback requires a certain mindset. It requires letting go of the emotional sting long enough to see the situation from above, like a map where every choice leads to a predictable outcome. It requires recognizing the difference between impulsive retaliation, which satisfies anger for a moment, and deliberate action, which teaches a lesson that lasts. I didn't want to embarrass him publicly just because he embarrassed me. That would make me no different from him. What I wanted was something more lasting, an impact he would feel even when no one else was watching. The more I observed him, the clearer it became that his greatest weakness wasn't anger, or pride, or impatience. His greatest weakness was that he believed he could not be challenged by someone he considered beneath his authority. He mistook my quietness for vulnerability, my patience for fragility. He thought that because I chose not to argue, I lacked the ability to respond. And that misunderstanding gave me more power than he realized. The behind-the-scenes planning wasn't about plotting step-by-step revenge. It was about waiting for the moment that would naturally arrive, the moment when he needed something from me, expected something from me, or relied on me in a way he wouldn't admit publicly. People with inflated egos always create situations where they overestimate their independence. They speak boldly, act carelessly, and forget that the world is woven with connections, favors, and responsibilities. And eventually, that realization shaped everything. I didn't need to chase revenge, the opportunity would present itself naturally. All I had to do was remain calm, stay observant, and wait. And waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. Waiting means preparing yourself mentally to act when the moment finally appears, a moment where the payback will feel organic, unavoidable, and perfectly suited to the lesson he needed to learn. There is a certain satisfaction in planning quietly, a certain confidence that grows when you know you are not acting out of anger but out of purpose. The more I prepared, the more I understood that his insult had given me a clarity I didn't know I needed. It revealed the entire dynamic between us in a single moment and showed me exactly what needed to be corrected. He may have thought he controlled the moment with his words, but in truth, he handed me the chance to reshape the relationship entirely. Planning in silence is powerful because no one sees it coming. While he continued his life as if nothing had happened, carrying on with the same arrogance, the same careless words, the same dismissive tone, I carried something else, a quiet, steady resolve. A resolve that grew with every observation, every detail, every reminder of the moment he crossed a line he didn't even respect enough to acknowledge. The behind-the-scenes planning became less about revenge and more about clarity, less about anger and more about purpose. It wasn't about punishing him, it was about resetting the boundaries he ignored. And as that plan took shape silently, steadily, and without a single sign on the surface, the stage was being set for a moment he never imagined, a moment crafted not in rage but in patience, not in noise but in strategy, not in haste but in the quiet determination to show him the weight of the words he thought would disappear as easily as they were spoken. There is a strange moment in every story of arrogance when the person who once felt untouchable suddenly begins to sense that something is off, something is slipping, something is no longer moving in their favor. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, like a shadow stretching across a room. And that moment always arrives too late. For my nephew, it began with small shifts he didn't immediately recognize, the subtle change in how people around him reacted, the way certain opportunities no longer landed in his lap as easily, the unexpected silence he received in moments where he once expected applause. But the most critical shift was internal, the moment when a part of him unconsciously registered that the confidence he once flaunted so freely was beginning to crumble under its own weight. People who rely on arrogance as armor eventually realize that armor cracks. The moment he insulted me, he believed he had established dominance, proven a point, or secured his place as the one in control. But arrogance blinds people to consequences, and when consequences finally arrive, they hit harder than the original insult ever intended. My nephew's downfall didn't begin with anything dramatic. It began when he started questioning why things no longer unfolded in the predictable pattern he was used to. He didn't understand yet that the cycle he had created, disrespect, entitlement, carelessness, was beginning to turn against him. There's a specific expression people wear when they realize their power was never real. It starts with a flicker of confusion, a tightening around the eyes, a hesitation in speech. It's the look of someone trying to connect dots they didn't know existed. He had always assumed his behavior had no consequences because nobody had ever challenged him, corrected him, or pushed back. So when life began offering him subtle corrections, when people stopped tolerating his tone, when opportunities shifted away from him, he felt something unfair. He began noticing that the people he once dismissed no longer sought his approval. They stopped laughing at his jokes. They stopped giving him the responses he expected. Some even avoided him. He couldn't understand why the dynamic around him was changing, but I knew. It wasn't magic. It wasn't revenge unfolding yet. It was the natural result of arrogance wearing thin. The moment you treat others as stepping stones, those stones eventually shift, and when they shift, you stumble. My silence after his insult played an important role in this shift. Silence is unsettling for someone who thrives on reaction. He kept waiting for me to confront him, to argue, to explode something that would validate his confidence. But when none of that happened, he was left alone with his thoughts. That's where real consequences begin. The human mind is far harsher than any external punishment. People start replaying their own actions, re-evaluating their choices, sensing the shift in energy around them without understanding the root. My silence became the mirror he didn't want to look into, the reflection that showed him more truth than any argument could. There came a moment when I caught him looking at me differently, not with confidence, not with amusement, but with a hint of uncertainty. That uncertainty was the beginning of his realization. He hadn't expected me to stay calm. He hadn't expected me to say nothing. He hadn't expected the weight of his own actions to catch up with him. The arrogance he once wore so proudly began to feel heavy, uncomfortable, even embarrassing. You could see it in his posture, in the way he avoided eye contact, in the rare moments when he tried to speak more politely, unsure whether he should test the boundary he'd crossed or retreat quietly. That is the thing about arrogance, the moment it cracks, everything beneath it is exposed. The confidence was only ever a mask. The toughness he projected was only ever a shield. And when those things fall away, what remains is someone who doesn't know how to navigate without them. He had spent so long building his identity around superiority that when it began to crumble, he was forced to confront a version of himself he didn't recognize. His downfall became even more apparent when he found himself in situations where he needed support, advice, or guidance. The same people he once mocked or dismissed were suddenly the ones whose help he required. And nothing humbles a person faster than realizing they need the very people they once disrespected. He hesitated before asking questions. He stumbled over his words when requesting assistance. He tried to soften his tone, to hide the panic in his voice, to mask the discomfort of relying on someone he once tried to belittle. But the most defining moment, the moment he realized beyond doubt that his arrogance had turned against him, came when he attempted to behave the way he used to, only to be met with a completely different response. People no longer tolerated his sharp tone. They no longer excused his behavior as youthful confidence. They no longer gave him the benefit of the doubt. He found himself standing in a position where the world no longer supported the image he had built. And that is when the truth hit him. The insult he threw so carelessly had been the first crack in the foundation he had assumed was unbreakable. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It didn't involve shouting, confrontation, or public humiliation. It was quiet, steady, and undeniable. His downfall came from within, from the slow erosion of the false identity he had created, from the natural consequences of disrespect, from the weight of his own behavior catching up to him. And in the end, as he stood there, no longer as certain, no longer as see. There comes a moment in every story of disrespect when the person who has been underestimated finally steps forward, not with anger or noise, but with a quiet certainty that changes everything. That moment arrived for me long after the insult had settled, long after the sting had faded, long after everyone assumed I had either forgotten or forgiven. What they didn't realize was that some moments don't disappear, they settle inside you, take root, and grow into something far more powerful than the insult that created them. My nephew's words had done exactly that. He had spoken with the kind of casual arrogance that only someone young and sheltered could possess, a tone that suggested he believed he knew the world better than anyone else, including me. He didn't pause to consider what his words meant, how deeply they cut, or how publicly he chose to deliver them. But I remembered every detail, every laugh in the room, every glance exchanged by people who thought I wouldn't respond. They read my silence as weakness, but silence, when chosen intentionally, becomes a tool of extraordinary force. In the days that followed, I watched him continue with life as if nothing happened. He strutted around with the same misguided confidence, throwing jokes, flexing his knowledge, acting as though he was untouchable simply because he believed youth made him superior. The older generation in the family shook their heads quietly but said nothing, because families often tiptoe around the egos of the young. They didn't want conflict. They didn't want drama. They didn't want to escalate a moment they hoped would disappear on its own. But I knew better. I knew that when disrespect is left unchecked, it doesn't fade, it grows bolder. It becomes a habit. And habits, if not corrected early, become part of someone's character. That was not something I was willing to allow, not for his sake and certainly not for mine. Not because I needed revenge, but because I understood the weight of lessons. As I observed him from a distance, I began to notice the cracks in the image he projected. His confidence was loud, but it wasn't strong. It was fragile, built on bravado rather than wisdom. He wanted to be seen as brilliant, capable, dominant, but beneath the surface, he was still unsure, still searching for validation in the most reckless ways. And I realized that the most impactful response to his insult would not be punishment or humiliation or any dramatic confrontation. It had to be something far more meaningful, something that would stay with him long after the moment passed. Revenge, in stories like these, isn't always about hurting someone back. Sometimes it's about giving them the kind of wake-up call that forces them to grow in ways they didn't know they needed. So I waited, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. Timing matters. Deliver a lesson too soon and it will be ignored. Deliver it too late and it loses its edge. I needed him to walk far enough in his own illusion to feel the contrast when reality finally met him. And eventually, the opportunity arrived, not because I forced it, but because life has a way of presenting the perfect moment to those patient enough to recognize it. There was an upcoming family event, one where everyone would be present, including people he admired deeply. He had been preparing for it with excitement, talking non-stop about how he would impress everyone, how they would acknowledge his intelligence, how he was finally going to prove himself. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed nobody else in the room could outshine him. I let him talk, let him build his expectations, let him believe he was walking into a stage built for him. When the day arrived, he carried himself like a star, shaking hands, smirking, offering opinions that were more noise than substance. He didn't know that I had planned something subtle yet unavoidable, something that would show him, without ever raising my voice, why humility matters, why respect matters, why the way you treat people matters more than you think. My plan wasn't dramatic, but it was precise. It involved placing him in a position where his knowledge was tested, where his assumptions were challenged, where his confidence was forced to confront reality. I didn't embarrass him, I simply allowed the truth to reveal itself. People who once humored his arrogance now saw the gaps he tried so hard to hide. Questions he thought he could answer slipped through his fingers. Points he tried to make fell flat. The admiration he expected didn't come. Instead, he found himself quietly overwhelmed, realizing he had stepped into something he wasn't prepared for. I watched him struggle, not with pleasure, but with purpose. Because this was the moment he needed, the moment when he understood that respect isn't gained through loudness or attitude or bravado. Respect is earned through knowledge, humility, effort, and the willingness to listen. By the time the event ended, the shift in him was visible. The arrogance had faded, replaced by a silence far different from mine. His silence wasn't a choice, it was reflection. A quiet acknowledgement that perhaps he had been wrong, that perhaps there was more to learn, that perhaps the person he dismissed so casually wasn't someone he should have underestimated.